Now in this tutorial, we will be looking at scaffolding and generating controllers and views for functionality in our website. So far, we've looked at what's a controller, what is a view, how they link, how you go about creating a new view and attaching it to a controller. What we didn't do was actually linking the model to everything. So we looked at the C, we looked at the V, we've looked at the M, we've looked at them in fair isolation, and now we're going to actually tie them all together. So in this tutorial, we look at a procedure or process in Visual Studio and most MVC frameworks that you'll use called scaffolding, where we associate the model with the controller and generate the view accordingly. Now I have here on screen my entity framework diagram, and what we will be doing to begin with is create a course controller and some views associated with CRUD functionalities for courses. In short, C is for create, R is for read, U is for update, and D is delete. So CRUD operations basically manage or govern everything that a user would ever do on a website that is data driven. So without further ado, we will go about creating a courses controller, linking it to our course model, and generating a bunch of views that allow us to interact with our courses in our database. So to start this procedure, we go over to our controllers folder, we right click and click add, then we select controller. Then we're given this kind of wizard window where they ask us, what kind of controller would you like? You see here you have MVC 5, you have Web API 2 with a bunch of other things. What we really want out of this one is MVC 5 controller with views using Entity Framework. Very specific. So we select this one and then we click add. Then they ask us, what would you like as the model class? So from this drop down, we'll see every single CS file that is in our project listed here, but we're not interested in every single CS file. We're looking specifically for the one with the name that corresponds with our mission. So in this situation, we want the course, which is found in our models folder. And remember, if we drill down into the EDMX, we would see the CS file. I'll just do that quickly and give you some context. So we drilled into models. We have our entity framework diagram. We drill into that. And then down here, you'll see that you do have course.cs. And that is the model that we want to use to generate this controller. So once again, we right click controllers. We go to add. We click controller. We select MVC5 controller with views using Entity Framework and click add. Then we select from this drop-down box, course, and the data context class would be our school management DB entities. All right, so we can just select that. We can choose to use async controller actions. I'll forego it this time and then I'll use it the next time. And then they're asking us which layout page would we like to use for our views. So we see here, we have a checkbox that says generate views. We have a checkbox here that says reference script libraries, which we really don't need to do since our layout page already has the references. So we will just select our layout page by clicking the ellipsis button there. We go into views, shared, and then we select our layout. Once again, you can have multiple layouts, so you choose a layout that is appropriate for this situation. And then by the end of it, they would be asking for the controller name, but you can see, following the same naming convention, it is auto-generated using the name of the model, which is course, they just say courses, and the word controller. So the naming convention maintains. Then we click add. It will go through a scaffolding exercise. At the end of this exercise, you'll be given a class file and you'll see much more code than we're used to from our home controller. All right. Now, once again, our controller is just a class with the name of the model in this situation, and the word controller, and it's inheriting from a base class called controller. Then they go about initializing our data context object, which allows us to communicate with our database. Remember, I keep on saying that this diagram is our bridge. Well, this bridge is all invoked in this one line here in line 15. So we initialize this object to a new instance of our entities diagram, which establishes the connection to our database. Then if we look through, we'll see that we have quite a few methods that were generated and some comments to guide us as to what is happening here. So the first one is index. Remember, as always, index is the first file that should ever be in any website. And this one returns a view, but then in this situation, we see that we have parameters in this view. All right, so you see that you have DB, which is the same name as our database context, and we're running a query against the courses table, and we're just parsing all of those to list. Further down, you have a details page, which is taking probably an integer. All right, so that question mark really means that it could be null, it could be a value. It is preparing that it might be a null ID value that is coming in, and then it has a cursory check to say if the ID that is passed in is null, then return some bad request code. All right. Otherwise, it will go on to source that course by ID. So it says db.courses.find. Find will return any record with this ID and store it in a variable called course. And then it will go on to say if the course that is returned is null, meaning nothing comes back at the end of this query, then it still says HTTP not found. So you see quite a few returns here, and none of them are views, right? So action result, but then action result allows you to have different values returned. As long as you have the correct value or an acceptable value, then you have a correct return type. So we can return an HTTP status code result for bad request. We can return HTTP not found, or we can return view with our sourced course, right? So we looked for the course, and then once nothing is null and everything checks out, then we return the view with our course data. We also have a create method stub, and we go on to see that there are two create method stubs. We have one to get, which just returns a view, and then one for posting, which comes with some security features and some binding, and as we go along, we'll explore them more. And this one makes sure that the data coming back is valid before it goes about adding it to our database, our courses table in our database, and then saving the changes, and then redirecting to index. If the state is invalid, then it returns to the view with the course with some error messages stating what is missing or what was invalid. In the same way, we have two creates, we have two edits. So we have one edit here, which is a get, and we have one edit here, which is a post, and the code bases are quite similar. And then we have a similar construct for our deletes. And then we have a dispose function. So all of this was generated just by you adding a controller, adding the class, generating the views, and you'll get all of this. So the key in what I just said was generating the views. We have the methods, so we have to ensure that we have the views that correspond with these methods in a corresponding folder for this controller. So if I go to my Solution Explorer, I see here the controller was added, courses controller, but then I need to validate the views. And if we go down to views, we see here courses, that name, let me just collapse this. The names correspond, courses controller, courses folder. And you'll see that for each method that is here in the controller, you have a corresponding file. So if we click index, we will see quite a few things happening here that was not present on the previous index file. So we have here an inclusion of a model, all right, and it's of type IEnumerable. So C# has quite a few data types. If you've been doing this thing for a while, I'm sure this wouldn't be very foreign to you. But you have this being included because, in all fairness, the index file is getting a list, right? So remember, over here, we're passing up a list into index of db.courses.toList. So it is getting a collection type. All right, it is getting a list of courses. So your index page should display all of the courses. I'm sorry, that's the wrong index file. All of the courses that would have been in the database as at the time of you loading this page. All right, and then you have quite a few things happening here. You have this create button, action linked for create. And because index and create are in the same controller, you don't have to explicitly refer to the controller. So you could put on, the controller name, which would be courses. You can redirect to another controller. Of course, this would fail because there's no create inside of the home controller, right? But then by virtue of the fact that they are in the same controller, you don't have to be that explicit moving from index to create. So this works. Then we go on to create a table. We have two properties for our courses table that don't include the ID. So we had ID, we had title, and we had credits. We don't need to display the ID, and MVC knows you don't need to display the ID. So when they generated this page, they made sure to just exclude what they figure you wouldn't want to display to the end user anyway. So we have a display name for title and one for credits, and both of those are put into the header section of our table. And then we see them injecting some C# code here where they say for each. All right, so they're saying for each item in model being this here, or the data coming back. So once you pass data into the view, you can reference it by saying model. That's a keyword right there. So all of the data, and just by hovering over it, the tooltip is indicating that this references the collection of courses coming from the database. Once again, courses controller, index, we're querying our database, looking in our courses table and getting all of them and parsing them to list and passing that into the view. The view can identify all of that data coming in through the keyword called model. Since it's a collection, we need to list everything in that collection. So we say for each item in the model or set of data coming back, we want a row. So for each item, we want to generate a row, and this row should have one column for the title and one column for our credits, and then a third column with our action buttons, which would say edit, details, and delete, which each will route to the corresponding methods in our controller. All right, so remember in our courses controller, we had edit. Let me find edit quickly. We had edit, we had create. Well, we have two, but we have create, and we have details. And we also have delete. Now, we need to be able to browse to this page or any one of our pages. So I'm going to go to our layout page and make sure that our layout has a link that can bring us to that index page. So I'll remove our previously created test view link as we don't need it going forward. And I will just manually type this out. So li, so I'm creating a new nav property or nav link, setting an action link. So @HTML dot action link, and then I'm passing in as parameters what I want to be printed, and what I want to be printed would be courses. I'll just print courses, and then we're looking inside of the index. Sorry, we're looking for the index method inside of our courses controller. All right, so remember, it is what is displayed, the action or the view that we want, and the controller that we should be able to find it in. Now, having done all of that, we'll hit F5 and see what happens. Now, this is the result of our page so far, and we see here that we have a link called courses. When we click that, we should be guided to our index page. And when that page loads, we see it is empty. We don't have anything in our database, right? But then we see it's consistent with what we saw in the view. We have index, which I believe is in an H2 tag. We have a link that says create new, which when we click it should lead us to our create form. And then we have the two headings for our tables, but we have no rows and columns afterwards because we have no data. Remember, it is generating each row for what is in the database. So if the database is empty, then no rows will be generated. That for each loop will not run. So let us go about creating something new. So create new brings us to our create view, which asks us for a title and the credits. So you see the create view is actually auto-generating, and I'll just head over to Visual Studio while we're still in debug mode and take a look at the create view. We see it generated a form. All right, so there is an HTML helper function called begin form, which renders out a form in HTML. And then using some Bootstrap code, we're getting a form here that does a validation summary with a class attached to it. And there's a certain pattern here that as you see the code more and more, you catch on to the pattern. So I'm deliberately not going into the details of certain things because I want you to see and appreciate the pattern. As we go along, those certain things will come to light more and more. And then we have a div. And in this div, we have a label. So you see another HTML helper function being used. And we're looking at the model. And we're creating a label for title and giving it some Bootstrap classes. Sorry. All right. And then down here, we generate an editor for. So there's a helper function that says editor for. Pretty much this just says, I will look at the data type that I'm supposed to create a control for and create an appropriate control. So if we had a Boolean, for argument's sake, that we needed to create something for, editor for would automatically generate a checkbox. So there are situations where you want to use editor for ease, and there are times when you need to be explicit. So you could say html.textbox for. All right, so you can be explicit, and there are certain times you want to be very explicit because editor for has some limitations. Textbox for comes with more textbox related functions that allow you to do a few things otherwise. So we want a text box for our model, and then we have a little lambda expression here to say model.title. And then we're adding HTML attributes. If you remember from HTML, when you have an HTML tag, you can add in attributes such as ID, class, placeholder when it comes to text boxes. So we're adding new HTML attributes. And remember, this is all C#, so we have to treat it a bit differently from how we would have in straight HTML. So we're adding HTML attributes, and we're adding, once again, another collection of attributes. Now, if you use text box for, then some of the code here will also have to change. So you won't be able to say new HTML attributes in this manner. You'll have to refactor your code a bit. So to not complicate the situation, as we're just whetting our appetite, I'll leave it on editor for, and then we'll move along. So we see editor for is generating our text box, and it's assigning a Bootstrap class called form-control to it. We also have another section for validation message, which means that if we stipulated at the database level that this field is not nullable, then the validation message would know that once we try to submit a null value or an empty field when we click submit on our form, it will reject it, like we saw in our controller logic where it checks is valid. So if it is not valid, then it will reject it and return the view with whatever values came back, and the validation message would show accordingly. So it does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. And then at the end of it all, we have our submit button, which just gets a bootstrap class for default. So I'm going to change this to success. So having changed it to success, we'll just save changes. We're still in debug mode, and we'll just go back to our screen and refresh and allow it to reload our page with our changes. And there we go. Now let's go about creating a new course. So I'll call this one Introduction to Web Design. Make sure I got my spelling right. And then, like I was saying with the edit for, it knows that credits is supposed to be an integer. So it is actually giving us a text box. I'm actually typing text right now. It's not accepting it because the control that it's generating for it is a number picker. It's of type number picker. If I inspect element, I'm sure I'll see input type to be number. There we go. So it is restricting me and what I am able to enter. So usually Introduction to Web Design is a 3-credit course. So I'll just click create. And there we go. So we go back to our index page. All right. And now we see that we have a generated row with 2 columns, one for the title, one for the credits, and then another column which had our action buttons for edit, details, and delete. And each one will bring me to the corresponding page according to the title. So if I click edit, and I'm actually going to bring up Visual Studio this time around and put a breakpoint on our edit action. All right, so each method here is called an action. So the breakpoint is sitting there. We're still in debug mode. And then I'm going to click edit. And then we take the time out to dissect what happens in Visual Studio. So the breakpoint is hit, and then if I hover over ID, I see that ID 1. And that's because our newly created record in our courses table has an ID of 1. And then if we step through our code, we see that if ID is equivalent to null, this evaluates to false, so it skips by that. And then it goes on to run this query, which then says, find the course with the ID 1. So if I step by that, it runs that query and it will go through some stuff. And then it should return course. So if I hover over course, I'll see that it comes back with a bunch of generated values, but I can drill down and see the exact details. And here we'll see that we have our credits being 3 and our title being Introduction to Web Design. And like I was saying earlier, once there's a relationship, Entity Framework will automatically bring over whatever values are associated. So since we have no enrollments that are directly related to this particular course, then the list of enrollments is 0. It's empty. All right. So if I press F5, it will continue to evaluate if the course is not null. And we know it's not null because we just saw that it has a value. So the value is not null. So it will return the view with the corresponding data that we just looked up. And that's how we engage in the editing procedure, where it then says, bring up this form. So we see it looks very similarly to our create, except it comes preloaded with all the data because we looked for the course, got the data associated with the course, and then passed it back to this view. Now, if I make a change here, the expectation is that the course would update when listed in the index. So I'm going to change this because we expanded our program. So now we have Introduction to Web Design part 1, and then we'll have a part 2. I can also edit this view because I want this save button to look like green. So I'm going to go back over here. So I'm going to make a few changes here on this view. Either way, I want the save button to be green, much like on our create page. So I'll go back here. We're still in debug mode. We'll go into the Solution Explorer, find that view. So we look in Courses folder, and we look for the Edit view. And we'll see that it looks very similar to our index create page. And then we will modify our Submit button to have btn-success once again. So as you go along, you get auto-generated code, which is really just a guideline, but you will be prompted and influenced to give it your own individual flair and change certain elements as you see fit. So if I go back here and refresh, and you see it's hitting the breakpoint again, I don't want it to do that. So I'll just take off the breakpoint, just unclicked it, and I'll just click continue. And there we see that our page has reloaded and we have our green save button. Of course, our changes were undone, so I'll make this change again, and then I'll click save. And there we go. So the change was done, and we now have Introduction to Web Design 1. It's the same number of credits. And if I look at the details, the details action is doing a very similar thing. It's finding which course has the ID associated here. Of course, the ID is not visible, but if we hover over the button, we'll see in the bottom left corner that the link is being displayed. So it's going to courses/details/1. So that /1 is that parameter that gets passed into our action in the parameters. All right, so if I look at details to be specific, we'll see, we can find details. We see action result details. It's getting a parameter called ID. So whatever the ID is, it's being bound to this link right here, that such that when it is clicked, it is going to be passed to the details action in the ID parameter. And then it is evaluated, making sure that we're not wasting the time, because a database call, think of it as expensive. So you want to make sure that you vet your data as much as possible before a database call is required. So here we're just making sure that if nothing came over, then don't bother to waste the time to try and look for something that will be invalid. So we check, we validate that this ID value it may exist at this point. We don't know yet. Then we try and find it. And then we check if we found it. And if we didn't, we say not found, which is like a 404. And if we did, then we say, please return the view with the data associated with the course. So let us try that. And then we see here, this is our details view, very simple page. And all it's doing is displaying the title and credits. So it's details, it's a view page. It's for viewing purposes. It's not for editing or creating. So this would be more like the R in CRUD. This is your read page, right? And then we can choose to go back to the list, which will just route us back to the same place this would route us to, or we can choose to go ahead and edit, which would be the U, the update. And then we don't want to update this again. We can just go back to the list. And then from here, we can also delete. So if I click delete, we'll be led to something of a confirmation page, which did a similar thing to the details. It looked for the course and it brought back the course and it's printing the details. And then it's asking you, are you sure you want to delete this? And then just to add to the aesthetics of the page, I'll just go and find this delete view. And then we can look through, we can change the verbiage as we wish. We can say, okay, delete, are you sure you want to delete this? And we can put this in an alert. So we can give it a class, and I'll give it an alert danger. All right, so that's a Bootstrap class, alert danger. Bootstrap has excellent documentation. I'll share that with you. So you can, if you're not so au fait with Bootstrap classes and what they do, you can always go to the getbootstrap.com, and they have excellent documentation where they break out all of their classes and their functions for you. So I made that change, and then I refresh to see my changes. All right. That's not the best. I think I'm using the class wrongly, but you can see where the Bootstrap class is helping me to just add a little individuality to the page as opposed to what was auto-generated for me. And I'd probably want the button to be red. So I'll find that button, and here's that button. It's a submit button. And I'll change that to BTN-danger. I believe for this one, I need to put alert, then alert. So I'll just do that, save, and refresh. And there we go. So this looks much better. We see that alert gave it a bit more padding, and then alert danger is what made it red. All right, so a lot of those Bootstrap classes you have to use in pairs, but take your time and look through the examples. And then our button is also red. So I'll delete it just to show that our code works. And what I'll do is also set a breakpoint in our courses. So we already loaded our get delete because we got the data, right? So we got the data for display purposes. That's what this one does. Now, when I click submit, as with any other page, it needs to do something. So like I mentioned before, each one has a get and a post. Edit has a get, and then it has a post. So your get is what happens when you browse to the edit page, but once you click submit, the post is what happens. So we'll see in our delete post what happens. Now the breakpoint is set, and then I will go ahead and click delete, and then it hits the breakpoint. So here it pauses. We see that the ID is 1. It is now going to find the course, and then Visual Studio 2017 allows us to do this cool thing where we just skip directly to a line. So I'm going to skip over this line. All right, and that means the query was run. So if we look inside of our course object, we'll see that it got the course. That's the ID, those are the credits, and that is the title. And then it's going to say remove from the table whatever data is in this object. All right, and then once that removal occurs, we need to save changes. I'll just press F5, and at the end of all of this, it is now going to redirect to our index action. So you'll see that this is also one big pattern that happens in every single action. In the edit action, we see where it does some operation. It validates that the data that has been put in since the edit is valid. And then it does something where it attaches the fact that this entity was modified, and then it saves the changes. So that's a nice quick way to do an edit. And then we return to the index. If we look at our create is rendering the view, but then it has a post where it is validating, then adding, saving the change, and then redirecting to index. That is pretty much the flow of any CRUD operation. You contextually write code to effect whatever change to the database. You're creating content, so you have to do it a particular way. Maybe you're editing content, so you have to find what it is that you're editing, and then let it know it has been edited, and then save the changes. And then in this case, we're deleting, so we have to get the file, or the record rather, that we're deleting, then save the changes, and then we always go back home to the list. The list is what shows us that the changes have been made. So I'm just going to press F5 and skip ahead, and then there we are, we're redirected to index, and we have an empty list. Now you can do that with any other data table that you have in your database. The same procedure that you just did for courses obtains for students, and it may be a bit different for enrollments, but I want to challenge you, go ahead and do it for students and create the student CRUD operations using the methods and techniques that you just learned in this video. Feel free to leave comments and let me know if you have any difficulty. I will be more than happy to assist you. Thanks again and have a good one.